So I'd like to welcome you all. We're on the Coast Salish territories, as was mentioned earlier, and we're on this big corporate campus, UBC, and we're in the #1 city in the world, so says Utne Reader, The Economist, and many, many other prominent publications. But is Vancouver really the #1 city for all its citizens? So I went around asking people, do they consider themselves first and foremost a Vancouverite or a Canadian? And what I've heard over the last little while is everybody says, I see myself first and foremost a Vancouverite. That's where I get my pride. I don't get my pride as much from seeing myself as a Canadian citizen. And yet every single one of us, except for the First Nations people, at some point in our genealogy came from someplace else. So we're really aware of citizenship, I think, in a very different way than most citizens in most places in the world, because I think each one of us could raise our hands and say, this hand represents a piece of my background from, in my case, my father was born and raised in Japan, or my mother's heritage, Irish, Scottish. Each one of us could probably say 2 or 3 different lines that we trace ourselves back to and think of. And certainly when a First Nations person comes to us and says, I've been here for 10,000 years, and you go, well, I've been here. And you feel kind of very conscious of a multiplicity of citizenships, and yet somehow when we end up in Vancouver, we think of ourselves as a citizen of Vancouver. And I think that when we think of that, I think it's because citizens of a city are really knowledgeable that we're the ones driving the economy of the country. And we're aware that we probably have a lot more power at the city level, certainly as Westerners, than we have at the nation-state level. And the concerns that percolate to the top often get played out at the neighborhood or at the city level, and that by the time they reach the national level, they seem very far from us, and it doesn't feel like it's our spokesperson who addresses them. So I was thinking about how many ways people start to work on something and get so frustrated by the national level and bring it home to the city level. And I think one example recently that came before City Council was the decision to join Canadian Municipalities Against Racial Discrimination. And I don't know whether Baldwin will talk about that, but this is something that came out of UNESCO, which is to get cities around the world together to develop best practices to fight racism and discrimination. Or something that I'm working on is designing an ideal city for women and girls. And we know that when we do these things, there's an intersectionality of the dimensions of citizenship, whether we're a woman, whether we're a refugee, whether we're First Nations, whether we're able-bodied or have different abilities. All of these things have to be interwoven, and we need to put those gender lenses on, we need to put the race lens on when we talk about citizenship. So I'm hoping as we continue on with this discussion about why is it so important for us to be citizens in Vancouver, and how that strength can really enable us to be better global citizens, but also to make our nation state a state that really does work for city. Because after all, in Canada, 80% of the citizens live in cities, and yet we only get 8 cents of the tax dollars. So often, although we're addressing many of the concerns of citizenships at the city level, we actually don't have the funding to deal with those problems. So I just want to throw some of those concepts out for you to think about as we continue the discussion this morning. And I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, because we have an hour in which the panelists will present, then a break, and then we'll get into a good discussion, because there's a lot of amazing bodies of knowledge embedded in each of the individuals I can see out in the audience today. And I'm just assuming everybody's read our bio, so I'm not going to read anybody's bio. I was an activist in the downtown east side for 10 years and been active in women's issues and democracy and social sustainability for a long time, and now I'm Vancouver City Councillor. So, but that's a different discussion. So I'd like to start with Daniel Hiebert, who's professor of geography, and if he wants to add anything more about his background, he will, but I'm sure you can Google him and find some more things.
Thanks to the organizers, thank you, and good morning to everyone. And I think a PowerPoint set that I brought with me is just being put up on the screen right now. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this title, Dynamics of Diversity and Citizenship in Canadian Cities. And I just want to reflect for a second on what Asha spoke about in terms of those four clusters or four perspectives on citizenship. She talked about status, rights, participation, and identity. And I'll be skipping and leaping between these different ways of thinking about citizenship, but I think I'm probably most interested in the issue of identity, that is the sense of identification and belonging with a place. And in order to introduce that as a focus of concern, I think the key question is, in order for a person to feel identification with a place, they have to feel welcome and part of that community. So an issue then on that, what you could call soft side of citizenship, as opposed to the hard side of what passport you carry. An issue on that soft side of citizenship is whether a person feels like that they belong to a society, and therefore the society has to be open for that belonging to take place. Now, hopefully okay, so that doesn't work, but I'm sure this will. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about demographic change that's happening in Canadian cities. And I'll speak there about immigration as a driving force of that demographic change and the increasing socio-cultural diversity that arises as this process is unfolding. And then I'll talk a little bit about the specificity of places that are associated with increasing diversity in Canada. I can't resist, after having just spent a year in Europe, making a little bit of a diversion at this point and talking about how these issues are at play in European cities. I just lived for a year in a city called Malmö, which is in the south of Sweden, and got a strong taste over that year of how Swedes and, well, Nordic people and, in general, Europeans are interpreting these issues. And then I want to ask whether the big concerns that are arising in Europe might be imported into the Canadian milieu when we talk about these questions. So a graph that's probably familiar to most of you, it just indicates the nature and scale of population or demographic change in Canada. And the interesting thing, from my point of view as someone who cares about demography, about this chart, is that if you go back 20 years ago, 1991, and prior to that, Canada's population dynamics were largely the result of the birth and deaths of people already living in Canada. It was a phenomenon of natural increase. And what's happened is the scale of natural increase has fallen a lot as people have curtailed their fertility, and the scale of immigration has increased. And so what's been happening since 1991 is immigration has been the driving force of population change in Canada. And you can see very clearly on that graph that in not too long a time, immigration will be the only driving force of population growth in Canada. That will happen around about 2020, maybe 2022, something in that kind of order. A second visualization of how big a set of changes are happening is this one. And this is a chart that goes over a 50-year period, looking both backward and forward. It looks back to 1981 and forward to 2031. It's a set of population projections done by Statistics Canada. And what they have done is they've looked at the composition of the foreign-born population across all of Canada and which region of the world people came from. As you can see, back in 1981, which isn't really that long ago, it's only 30 years ago, the vast majority of the foreign-born population were born in Europe. As you fast forward through that chart, you can see there's a complete rebalancing between the lightest color and the darkest color on that chart. And by 2031, a significant majority of the foreign-born in Canada will be born in Asia, with also quite significant numbers from Africa and the Americas, but Asia really is the big story. And of course, in Vancouver, we see that on a day-to-day basis when you get on a bus, when you walk the streets, when you look around the city. Another take on this is, well, these are dynamics at the nation state. What happens if you get down to another level from the nation state? And this particular chart contrasts the demographic composition from an ethnocultural point of view of Canadian cities versus the rest of Canada. There's two bars for the chart are for the most recent census of Canada, 2006, the last good census of Canada. And the bars on the right-hand side look at the projection for 2031. And you can see the black bit in these charts indicate people who were themselves born in another country and have come to live in Canada. I guess it's kind of white. The lightest color on the chart indicate the children of those folks. So people whose parents were born outside of Canada but were born in Canada. And you can really get the stark contrast between the census metropolitan areas and other parts of Canada. For the census metropolitan areas, already in 2006, just about 50% of the population were either first or second generation immigrants. And outside those census metropolitan areas, it was less than 20%. And even if we fast forward now 20 years into the future and look at the situation for 2031, that ratio actually is maintained, and maybe, I haven't actually done the math, but I think it's actually intensified by 2031. At that point, about 57 or 58% of the residents of Canadian cities will have been born outside the city, or their parents will have been born outside the city, whereas outside the country, sorry. Whereas outside the Canadian cities, that ratio will still be only around 19%. And really, this is what's structuring that dynamic. This is a chart that just looks at the most recent period when the last census was taken, between 2001 and 2006, and shows the settlement location of the newcomers who came to Canada during that half of a decade. And as you can see, Toronto is the big story, and it's kind of a pity that you're going coast to coast to coast and not sort of checking out the scene in Toronto. Maybe at another conference date you might want to think about that. Another round of these kinds of questions, you may want to think about that. But 4 out of every 10 newcomers who arrive in Canada settle in Toronto. Another 3 out of every 10 go to either Montreal or Vancouver. Already you've got 7 out of 10 in just those 3 places. And most of the other 3 out of 10 go to other Canadian cities. And by the time you're down to the 10th most significant place, which is Windsor, Ontario, they're receiving less than 1% of the newcomer population. So it's an extremely geographically specific phenomenon that we are witnessing in terms of this movement of migrants to Canada. And this chart gives you just a little bit of a visualization of how it looks in one particular place, which is Toronto. In a minute I'll talk about Vancouver. But I really like this one. It's actually stolen from the Toronto Star, so nobody can take it from me because I've already plagiarized, so we'll have to leave it there. But on the bottom left-hand side of the chart, you get a visual depiction of Toronto's population about a half of a century ago in 1961. And the dove gray color are people who have a European ancestry, and you can see that that's pretty much the whole story in Toronto in 1961. Then the inner circle of the big donut gives us a sense of Toronto in 2006 and what the population composition was. And as you can see, all the other colors of the rainbow in that chart are now almost half of the population, 43 or 44% in 2006. And then if we project out to what it's going to look like in 2031, you can see the outer ring of the donut. And by that point, people with a European ancestry are only about a third of the population of Toronto.
Sorry, how is mixed race spelled up in here?
Well, this one is based on, just a second. Yeah, this one is based on this category called visible minority, and where mixed race would come in is other visible minorities in here.
So it's not like whether you're half European ancestry, half Asian.
No, no. And this is a projection, if I could just, should I just answer that question, or should I'm happy to do it, so I'll answer it now. This is a projection that's done on something called the population group question in the Canadian census. And the population group question says, is this person, and then there's a question mark, and then they list a number of categories, and it's white, Chinese, black, Filipino, Indian, etc. There's 13 categories for that question, and one of those categories is mixed of these categories, and another one is other of these categories. And they use those data to produce this chart. That was done as a projection about a year and a half, 2 years ago by Statistics Canada. Oh yeah, and I wanted, just before leaving this image, I just wanted to show you one, I think, really intriguing point. The largest group outside of Europeans in Toronto in 2031 will be people whose ancestry is South Asian. That's the top, I don't know what you call that, sort of a terracotta color, something like that. They will be 2.1 or 2.2 million, which is larger than the entire population of Toronto in 1961. It's also larger, well, it's about the same scale, actually, as the Vancouver population of today. And that will be just the South Asian community of Toronto in 2031. I won't spend long on this rather busy slide, but I think it gives you one important little message. What I've done is I've looked for each of the 3 biggest cities of Canada at the data for 2006, and I just identified what are the top 12 birthplace groups outside of Canada. And for each of those countries, I've colored in highlight, in a yellow, the groups that are unique in that top 12 list for each of the 3 cities. And the point I want to make there is, yeah, there's a fair bit of continuity between what's happening in Toronto and Vancouver. You get the top 5 are pretty close in those 2 cities. But beyond that, you get really specific groups in each of these 3 cities. So in Montreal, more than half of the top 12 are actually unique to Montreal as big ethnocultural communities. Montreal has the only Haitian community of any significance, really, in Canada. The only Moroccan community, for example, of any significance in Canada. And if you flip over to the Vancouver side, we have the largest Taiwanese community, the largest Korean community, the largest Fijian community in relative terms of these 3 cities. And you can see the other groups in that configuration. What I'm getting at here, again, is that sense of geographical specificity. And this comes out of the Vancouver Foundation report card on quality of life in Vancouver that was just released a few weeks ago. And it points out that if we were to take Vancouver and just think of it as a village of 100 people, so we're just really dealing with percentages here, 42 people in Vancouver of that 100 would have had a first language other than English. And then you can see where people are born. 9 of them would have been born in Europe, 6 in China, 4 in India, et cetera, et cetera. 11 would be people without Canadian citizenship. And the last one is people's ethnocultural origin. And you can see what that composition would look like. And that's really different than Montreal, really different again than Saskatoon, really different again than Ottawa, et cetera. And then the last scale I want to look at is the scale of the local. And here I have a series of 3 maps of Greater Vancouver, or Metropolitan Vancouver, and I've looked at the relative concentration of 3 particular ethnocultural groups that are identified in all those numbers that I've been showing you a moment ago. The one on the, I have to actually look to make sure I got the right ones. Yeah, the one on the top left is people who self-declared as Chinese in the last census. On the top right, people who self-declared as coming from a southern Asian region. And on the bottom left, people who self-declared as coming from Western Asia. And I want to spend a minute thinking about the way this set of maps depicts or represents something of the reality of what life is like in metropolitan Vancouver. That set of maps, it's quite a common way of visually showing where groups are, especially for people like me who've got a geographical training. This is the kind of stock and trade of my profession. And what it does is it gives you a sense of a patchwork. It gives you a sense that, you know, the West Asians are up on the North Shore. The South Asians are down in Surrey Delta and actually quite a long way away in Abbotsford and Clearbrook area, whereas the Chinese Canadians are mostly in Richmond, Burnaby, and the city of Vancouver. And you get that sense in public culture all the time. Now, I've just lived a year in Europe, and what I find in Europe is those maps are highly controversial. Showing a map like this is a really controversial thing. In fact, that donut diagram of Toronto, if a major European newspaper were to publish that diagram, that would show that people of European ancestry would be going from about 90% of the population in 1961 to about 35% of the population in 2031, that actually could cause riots on the street in a European city. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. That the politics around those numbers, the politics around the perception of those numbers, are so sharp that it could really drive public participation to even begin to ask and show these kinds of phenomena in such stark kinds of ways. In Europe, most people looking at this set of maps would see this as symbolic of social fragmentation and a corrosive kind of attack on a coherent society or a cohesive society. In Europe, this would be presented as a group of people who would be choosing to live in parallel societies or in parallel lives. And I don't know how much attention you pay to European politics, but you may recall that just last week, Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, made a very strong set of statements about the unwillingness of newcomers to Germany to blend in, to assimilate to German culture, German society, German ways of life. And it's these kinds of maps that drive that perception. And it's also the on-the-street observation of German society that drives that perception. And I would say Germany is actually calmer about these sorts of issues than you would find in France or Italy or a number of other European countries. So I'm going to end in a minute, and I'll end by just posing the question, what does that do for people's perception of belonging, for their identity? What does that do for perceptions of citizenship in places? In Europe, I think these questions are asked in a way that make people feel acutely uncomfortable. If you're a newcomer, if you're a person of a non-mainstream cultural origin. And I'm curious the extent to which we will resist that kind of political culture that's happening in Europe versus the extent to which we will import that political culture. And I have to say that at the national political level, I'm rather pessimistic about this, and at the local political level, I'm quite optimistic about this. And there's time for discussion later, so we can have that discussion. But and I think that sort of combined pessimism and optimism tells us something about these scales and where we might want to go in a conversation about those scales. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was very helpful. And these slides will be available.
No, they're all stolen. They're all copyright free. You'll have to find them yourself. All stealable on the internet.
Our next speaker is Baldwin Wong, a social planner from the city of Vancouver. Wonderful person to work with. Baldwin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just stand here for a bit, and then I'm going to use the mic here. But before I start, we were asked the presenters to choose maybe an object or an image to bring forward to this conference to share, just to illustrate our notion of citizenship. I thought long and hard about it, and it was actually quite difficult. I mean, there are many things one can bring forward. However, something occurred to me because I recently received a very interesting package from, in fact, a speaker that you'll be hearing from later today, Professor Henry Liu, also from UBC. And they actually have put together a very interesting package which looks at a bit of history of First Nations and some particular communities in Vancouver. So I picked one of the drawings from that package, and you can't really see it very well from here, but I'm going to describe it a little bit. On this, it says the unanswerable argument. And it's actually I believe it is something copied from a newspaper or something in 1907, and it was actually archived by the Vancouver Public Library. So in this drawing, on the top part, there is a really beautiful Victorian-looking house, and it says, typical home of Vancouver white working men. And in front of the house, you can see some, probably family in front of it, and there's a girl, probably with her father. And the girl actually is sort of a bigger image of her dancing there or skip roping or something. Then down in the bottom, which is the interesting part, there is a building, and there's a oriental-looking chap there sitting and looks like he's smoking opium at the time. And I'm sure it's a Chinese person because it says, a warren on Carroll Street, Vancouver of course, infested by 2,000 Chinese. Okay, so this is 1907. And yeah, if you'd like to have a quick look, that would be good. But actually, I would like to fast forward time. In 2001, the City of Vancouver publishes a booklet called A Newcomer's Guide to the City of Vancouver. And it's also actually available in several languages, including Chinese. So times have changed, I believe, that for the City of Vancouver, we're becoming really open and welcoming to people from all places, in fact. And I think we have a very different notion of who are now the inhabitants of the city, who are we including and working with in the city. So I think that's kind of an interesting time capsule to illustrate history a bit. And I'm not an academic, so I'm not speaking as an academic nor scholar, but I believe this conversation is extremely important, in fact, because the notion of citizenship really concerns all of us living in, whether it's in Vancouver or elsewhere. So when I was asked to speak about the relevance of the nation and the city to our citizens, it occurred to me that before we even begin this conversation, we have to take a closer look at how individuals fit into cities. After all, cities are the foundation on which Canada is built, reflecting diverse economic, cultural, and political realities in different regions. How a person relates to their city may reflect how they view their role in this country. It may also give us a clue to what sort of role, if any, Canada has in their lives. We need to start with the question, and that's really the topic of my talk today. How does a person become the citizen of a city? Well, at the most basic level, we might say a person becomes the citizen of a city either by being born there or by moving there. While some people do spend their entire lives in the community where they were born, populations are increasingly becoming very mobile, as illustrated by Dan earlier. People move from one neighborhood to another and into Vancouver from other regions of BC, other parts of Canada, and from other countries around the world. Moving to a new city, regardless of where you're originally from, requires a lot of forethought and planning. There are a wide range of practical considerations that might go into making the choice to call a place home, including the price of housing, local amenities, job prospects, culture, quality of life, and proximity to family and friends. Because of these factors, people tend to move to neighborhoods where they are surrounded by others who are like-minded or in similar social and economic circumstances. I really like to stress that in this way, neighborhoods create a unique sense of identity for themselves and for those who live in them, often reflecting the values and lifestyles of their residents. As Ellen mentioned earlier, many people responded when they asked how they see themselves, citizened, where do they belong? They identify with the city. But I would like to add that, in fact, many people identify with the neighborhoods they live in. This is apparent in Vancouver, a city of 23 distinct neighborhoods, each of its own history, character, look, and feel. To say that you are either from Kisilano, Kerrisdale, or Grandview Woodlands in Vancouver is to make a proud statement of identity that's different from the others. So does a person become a citizen of a city merely by residing in it? Some would say yes. They might add to that definition, though, saying that becoming a citizen also means For example, obeying the law and paying taxes. This is from the state's point of view. But it still doesn't really take us beyond a basic sense of what it means to become a citizen. It doesn't fully capture a sense of what people do to make the city their own or to really make themselves a part of the city. For many people, there's a lot more involved. For some, there is an ideal notion of a citizen that entails more than simply being there. It means actively participating in the lives of those around them and the affairs of the place they live in. It could also mean to really become a citizen, a person has an unwritten moral or social obligation to give something of themselves to make the neighborhood or community, group, or city better. This ideal may be something sensed on an unconscious level that drives them, or it could be a carefully considered personal philosophy. It can manifest as small, quiet acts of individual kindness or public displays that benefit the entire city. It can be just helping family and friends, engaging in philanthropy, or volunteering. We see the benefits of all these ways of participating around us every day. In my own neighborhood, for example, there's a lady who has tended the gardens in front of my condominium building for the last 10 years. Well, she has done this voluntarily on her own because she enjoys gardening and wants to make her neighborhood a pleasant place for everyone who lives there. It would be easy for her to concentrate on a few flowers and brighten her own unit. But because my neighbor contributes her efforts and care in a place everyone can see, she brings color and beauty into lives of all of us. And we are happier because of her. We have something positive to admire, and all of us can talk about that and be proud of it. Because of that, my neighbor has brought our community closer together. This kind of gesture is the essence for me of what it means to become a citizen in that greater sense where a person goes beyond simply living in a place but gives back to the community, thereby making themselves a part of that place. What's also important about this is that when a person chooses to become the type of citizen who reaches out to others, it creates an overall atmosphere that encourages different neighborhoods, cultures, and other groups to bond with each other. And we need to continue to cultivate this sense of how people relate to others. And I would like to use another example. This is happening right now in an exciting initiative led by the City of Vancouver with many community partners, including UBC, which is called the Dialogues Project. The Dialogue Project involves a number of discussion circles and exchange programs designed to bring together members of Vancouver various immigrant communities, local First Nations, and urban Aboriginal groups. The goal is to encourage understanding and friendship between members of these communities that have not had a lot of experience with each other and may not know about their respective histories, challenges, and cultures. It is hoped that building positive and meaningful relationships like this will encourage these communities to collaborate and innovate with each other, building stronger connections among them and making the city more vibrant. One example that I've witnessed while working on the Dialogues project involved an exchange visit between some urban native youth and the local Mayan community, who are very few in numbers and are newcomers in the city. During the exchange, the Mayans shared the history of their people in Central America and spoke of the modern-day challenges they face trying to maintain the cultural identity in their home country. They also explained how those challenges have been compounded by moving to Vancouver, where they are a minority amount Central Americans, who are in turn a minority amount immigrant population, which is in itself a minority overall in this central metro area. However, the exchange brought out some deeply moving emotional stories from the Mayan group that brought many to tears, as there are many parallels between the Mayan experience and the urban Aboriginal youth who are also searching for a stronger sense of identity and belonging. Because of this chance to learn from one another, a bond has been created between members of these communities, one which could become the basis for them to explore opportunities together in the future. In their own way, the people who are participating in the Dialogues project are showing us how to become citizens of a city. They are showing us that as much as we reach out to members of our own neighborhoods and communities, it's also important to connect with people from other walks of life. In doing so, we'll make Vancouver more socially inclusive and dynamic. So when we ask, how does a person become a citizen of the city, we know that one has to do more than simply reside in a place, pay taxes, and obey the law, because this is only the existence on the surface. To truly be a citizen, a person who is of the city and not merely in it, one has to reach out to one's neighbors and hopefully to other communities. Only by actively engaging other citizens can a person truly be a part of the life of the city and play a role in shaping its very identity and destiny. Once we understand this, we can see that when a citizen looks at the city versus the nation, that person may have an intuitive sense that Vancouver and Canada are both relevant as parts of an expanding circle of care. It is a circle that starts with the individual, grows to include family, friends, and neighbors, expands further to include a neighborhood or community, then outward to the entire city, and from there, the region, province, country, and world. Certainly, there are those who do not wish to invest much of themselves in national citizenship. They may be content merely to be residents in Canada rather than taking the extra step of becoming citizens. There may be any number of reasons for this. They may be here simply for work or study, or they may have stronger attachments to their own home countries. In this respect, they may be similar to those who just live in a city but have no wish to become part of the community. Somewhere in the middle are those who care deeply about being contributing citizens in their cities while at the same time having little interest in becoming Canadian citizens. And that's a notion we can explore further. In this case, the meanings of citizen and resident become quite blurred at the local level. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are very committed to the idea of being Canadian citizens. Just as some citizens recognize the importance of contributing to their communities and cities, so there are people who believe participation in a national conversation is relevant and a way to ensure Canada truly embodies their values and aspirations. Because the question of what is home is so complex and has so many different meanings to different people, we need to recognize that a city or a nation's location on the expanding circle of care and their relevance to the individual is just as subjective and complex. Ultimately, what's most important is that members of our communities, whether at the local or national level, we commit ourselves to engaging with our neighbors to make our home the best it can be. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Baldwin. Our next speaker is Andrew Pask. Andrew has done a lot of work around the whole idea of public squares, and perhaps he'll be discussing that with us, and he's representing the Vancouver Public Space Network. Andrew.
I have the remote control in my hand here, but I've never used one of these before, so we'll see how it works. Just before I was coming up to talk here, I also realized that a couple of my slides seem to have been juggled around a little bit. So we may have a little bit less of a linear presentation right now than I initially intended, but that's okay. We'll make do with what we can. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Andrew Pask. I'm the director of the Vancouver Public Space Network. And I'd also like to start with an acknowledgement of the fact that we're on Musqueam territory, but not just Musqueam territory, unceded Coast Salish territory. I think that that added dimension adds a fair bit that we can talk about today in terms of a conversation on urban citizenship. So what I'm interested in talking about a little bit, and we'll see if this first slide works. It's just this button here? All right. Okay, good. What I'm interested in talking about today is the idea of the intersection between nation, that grand concept that has been around in good form for a few hundred years, and something that we associate clearly with it, citizenship, And then the idea of cities, which are now being seen as sites of citizenship, and a component in particular of city building that is very important, near and dear to my heart, that is public space. And I hope by the end of the conversation, what I'd like to do is paint a picture, I think, that suggests that there are good linkages between all of these components here. But before we get into that, what I want to do as a starting point is I want to step back a little bit and perhaps be a bit more general than some of my colleagues on the panel today, and talk a little bit from the perspective of one of the questions that the conference organizers very kindly put out in their questions to us, the panelists today. They said, how does the Canadian nation manifest itself at the local level? And I think that's a very good entry point for some of these conversations here, because one of the arguments I would make is that if we even look just at how the Canadian nation manifests itself, we see an extraordinary array of things that take place in the public realm and the public space, and that the public spaces in cities are very active landscapes for a lot of this discussion. So I thought I'd do a bit of a survey and try and think of some of the ways that this happens, and here's what I came up with. So I thought right off the bat we have something that in every country in the world, or most of them at any rate, you have a very active notion of city building at the national level around capital cities. They're a little bit of an extraordinary type of city, granted, but they also manifest themselves on the provincial level as well. Here you have the idea of the nation being planned into the city very, very, very overtly. In the city of Ottawa, for example, there is an extraordinarily large and well-funded federal agency called the National Capital Commission that plays this out on an annual basis with festivals, architecture, and a whole range of things. This is a picture of Ottawa as it was imagined before it was actually built. Here's the thing that we've got today. Different architectural form, but same idea. Grandiose imagining of the national on the local scale there. And as I said, similar ideals play out on the provincial level as well. But it isn't just the purview of capital cities. Symbols of the nation, if you like, are everywhere. You've got the ubiquity of flags. And they seem small, but they really are. I mean, there's sort of a symbolic order that plays itself out in cities all of the time. Not just flags, but of course things like very big flags. The biggest flag we've ever seen in the country, apparently, part of the Olympic celebration. Or indeed other celebrations too, like an annual celebration called Canada Day. So once again, the nation manifests itself there. But this is sort of the obvious stuff in a sense. There's also the headlines daily that introduce a whole micro level of symbolism into things, even on good old-fashioned print newspapers like that. All of these sorts of things, if you will, flags, celebrations, newspaper headlines, they contribute in that symbolic fashion to the sort of imagined community, if you want to use the language that Benedict Anderson was a few years ago. But there's other things too, a whole array of other things. This is the Grandview Viaduct. This is the site, as of yesterday, of an announcement of federal stimulus dollars. So the federal government, in fact, the nation, is literally building Canada, and they will let you know about it as well, because there will be one of those nice signs there that tells you that this is a national project. And believe it or not, the Prime Minister's office actually gets the XY geographic coordinates of every one of those signs too. So if you think it's just accidental where it's placed, you're wrong. This is about a $700,000 federal project that just got announced. Something again that is right under our feet. But then there's also things like the Canadian contribution, the national contribution, if you will, to architectural traditions. This is, of course, right outside our door here. It's an interesting one because, in a way, much of Canada's great contribution to the architectural traditions is in the field of modernist architecture. And you get some great national contributions into universalist design. Can talk about that if you like. It's a bit confusing, but nevertheless, it's part of our heritage there. I think there's some other things as well that play out in cities that reflect national and Canadian ideals. The way we think about cities is part and parcel with this. Here's an example. Think about the way that typical Canadian cities imagine street space, or the way that streets are constructed. Streets are invariably, if you look at the literature and the discourse of Canadian planning and engineering, seen as arteries, things that you're meant to move through. This is in contrast to the way that streets are often envisioned in other cities of the world, where they're seen as places that you can actually stop, slow down, sit down, grab a bite to eat, hang out with your friends. Here we generally have no loitering bylaws on streets and civic ordinances that actually encourage people to move on. And if we don't have that, we have a whole array of metaphors that talk about streets as arteries. So you can realize from that, of course, if you start slowing down too much, you might cause the city to have a coronary perhaps, something like that. It's part of the ideology of cities. And then there's the values piece that we've talked about already. Canadian cities manifest in many ways shared values. Shared is, of course, a loose term. Who knows how shared they are, but this is a nice picture of a peace march. I thought that kind of reflected one of the shared values in Canada, obviously not entirely shared by everyone in terms of anti-war movements, but pretty pronounced nonetheless. It was a bit more of an exciting picture than the Romano Health Report picture I had. Another sort of shared value there, but you get the idea, right? And if you don't have that, you can think about the way that values manifest themselves from the nation down to the city in terms of something like insight. This is another example. It goes in the other direction. You can see the federal government's ideology, the national ideology that they purport to represent, manifesting itself in a very material fashion in terms of insight. It's a shame that it's manifesting that way, of course, because the federal ideas about the nation and the way that they purport to inject them, no pun intended, into city spaces like the safe injection site, actually have a pretty contentious outcome. What about this? Concepts of identity. You know, we've talked about that. That's sort of the big thing when you think of citizenship and the nation. So much of the Canadian identity revolves around this place. If you pull out your wallet, if you happen to have any money in it, I don't at the moment, but if you do, look at all the dollar bills. They have so many of those signifiers all around them. Lake Louise is a great one. We don't have that many great urban signifiers the way they do in other cities. If you think about America, people often default to New York or LA or places like that. But maybe that doesn't matter so much in Canada. Maybe we can have signifiers like this, and then our signifiers are of a different sort of the kind that are envisioned with Danielle's work, the idea of multiculturalism, of diversity. Really, I guess the question, or where I'm leading with all this, is that I think the actual question that should have been asked is not where the Canadian nation manifests itself, but how do nations, plural, manifest themselves at the local level? Because that's really the tale of cities nowadays. Culture, ethnicity, indigenousness. The result of all of these types of dynamics and forces is that the idea of the nation in the city is a very, very pluralistic one. So we need to ask about nations, not nation. And the answer, when we think about how nations manifest themselves, is that it in itself is very multifaceted. We have it, again, in terms of Canadian identities, a little bit on the value side. This is an interesting cartoon from ages ago. It's about the same generation as Baldwin's there. You see Johnny Canuck kicking out the, what's that? Uncle Sam. Sorry, I always forget that name. Meanwhile, John Bull lives on in the background. So there's always been an element of pluralism in Canadian cities there anyways, because you get the British national signifier and the Canadian one playing out in an Ottawa cartoon. But there's more to it than that, of course, as well. There's very explicit architectural signifiers of different nations that manifest themselves in Canada as well, Chinatown being one. There's also the demographic stuff that Daniel talked eloquently about. This is a map that spatializes the immigrant community, singular, a bit odd to refer to it that way, granted, but the immigrant community in Vancouver. Here's another chart that shows the visible minority component and how difference is between Vancouver, the GVRD or Metro Vancouver, and Toronto. There's also other dimensions as well: cultural production, performance, even protest. This is from a vigil that was held outside the art gallery for the Iranian elections last year. A lot of times, however, this idea of how the nations manifest themselves in the city isn't as elaborate as that. It just is in playgrounds and parks, when you get a whole bunch of people playing together and everything gets along quite well. Everyone gets along quite well. So this is the narrative of cities as we now understand them. Gathering places, reception areas, aggregators, engines, heterogeneity, and more. And this goes part and parcel with the new role of cities and megacities. They are the centers of population, of economy, culture, migration, capital of all sorts. In a word, diversity writ large. And with this flow of diversity, and this diversity of flows, the city has, over the last century, come to act not as the trump of nation, It's not the new nation state, but as a parallel entity. Cities and nations work in concert. So what then of the idea of citizenship? I'm going to try and wrap this up now with a bit of a focus on that and tie that back to public space. There is, of course, the changing nature of citizenship, and if you think about the word citizenship and how it's played out over history, in recent history it was equated with nationalism. It had a big burst of energy in the 17th and 18th centuries and through to the present, but in its formative sense, and right up to the Middle Ages, before all of that stuff with nation building, it had its roots in the city. The etymology of the word reinforces that. City and citizen. So what's old, in a sense, is new again when we talk about urban citizenship. We are back to talking about city-scaled citizenship. And given that we often associate citizenship with the idea of rights and obligations, we also have a very active and really important discussion taking place right now, which Baldwin kickstarted, on the idea of urban citizenship. And what comes out of that, of course, is things like the right to the city. We should also, I suppose, if we're talking about the right to city, also think a little bit about the idea of obligations to the city, the rights and obligations discourse. And since the discourse of rights and obligations has several sets of assumptions embedded with them as well, we should be thinking about engagement with the city, opportunities to participate. This, of course, was intended to signify transparency at City Hall. I hope that's okay, Ellen. This was a statue of George Vancouver out front, wrapped in saran wrap. It was done, I think, to ward off any ill effect that may have come from a protest at one point in time. I just like it because I think it's got a good symbolic value there. The idea of people being able to engage with the city on all sorts of different levels there. I'm not going to go too deep into that one, though. We can chat about that after, because I think that's a conversation we should all be having. Instead, what I'm going to do is conclude by sketching out very briefly the role of the public realm within urban citizenship, or at least I'm going to try and add a few things to the list of pictures and ideas that I just presented about where the public realm picks us up. All of the photos I showed you, of course, were assets of or aspects of public space. But I'm going to try and just tie this up with a couple of other components about how the public realm and urban citizenship fit together. Actually, I think I'm going to do it with just one idea. That is, I think that public space and the public realm in the modern cities provide a very, very important component for one thing, one aspect that really girds all of the stuff that comes out of discussions on urban citizenship, and that is simply encounter. Public space is the space where we encounter one another, and that's a fundamental driver to the health of democracy in the city, the urban democracy, and also the sense of urban belonging and urban citizenship. Encounter means a number of different things, of course. We can encounter one another through debate. This is not Canada, of course. We would be in Tim Hortons if this was, but you get the idea. It's a place where we have discussion. Well, I mean, some people don't see Tim Hortons as public space. We'll call it a social space at any rate.
Rhizome.
Yeah, Rhizome Cafe, good point. But you get that idea. It's a place where we can debate and discuss and meet our friends and converse. It's also a place where we can celebrate. We had a great big party back in February that I think illustrated that point quite nicely. There's also how we encounter one another through our stories. So public space and urban citizenship, if you think about the role of public space and its informational quality alone, it's where we can exchange stories. This is a good news story. You don't often see those on utility poles, but Moses, the cat, came home. And that's a very good thing. So good, in fact, that it was information that needed to be put up around the neighborhood. There's also the opportunity for public space, by virtue of the fact that a lot of people live there, to present us with the reality of our social situation and its many manifestations. But finally, though, there is just that all-important element of encounter that is nothing more than people watching, nothing more, that is, and nothing less than people watching. That ability to see one another, whether or not you're gazing out of the window of a SkyTrain, you happen to see a stranger, or you pass them in the park as they're riding their bike and you walk past. Sarah William Goldhagen said it so eloquently in an article in the New Republic recently. She said, democracies need actual physical places in cities where dissimilar people routinely see and interact with one another. Only in such urban places, she said, can different people come against one another, bump against one another unintentionally, and, one hopes, thereby come to appreciate the company of strangers in the city. Thank you.
And our final speaker of the morning is Hayne Wei. Hayne, who has done so much to engage us all in these discussions and is the past president of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of British Columbia. Thank you, Hayne.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Actually, I'm the past president of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society. Larry Wong, who will be leading the Chinatown Walkabout this afternoon, is the past president. If you haven't had a chance to go for a walk through historic Chinatown, please do. Larry provides a great narrative for this. I want to thank the Liu Institute and the Trudeau Foundation for inviting me to talk at the conference. I also want to thank them for an incredible breakfast. I've been to conferences here at UBC. I've never had breakfast like this. I can't wait until lunch. Talking about meals, I want to begin off with a short story going back a few years. I used to work downtown, and I think the occasion was Lunar New Year, and my in-laws were having a celebration and dinner out in Richmond. I was late getting there. I had phoned to say, I'm coming. But by the time I got there, I was starved. Okay? Chinese seafood restaurant out in Richmond. The waiter brought out the first plate. You know, it's cold cuts with duck and chicken and all that stuff. And I am starved. So what does Hayne do? I grab my chopsticks immediately and go. And the waiter takes away the plate to a separate dish, a table, and divides it up 10 equal portions. And I get to eat 1/10 of what was delivered, right? I'm hungry. Anyway, the next dish that comes is lobsters in garlic, green onions, ginger. The gravy's dripping down to the noodles. I am hungry. And I go, and again, the waiter takes it away. Side table divides it up 10 equal portions. I eat my portion immediately, and I'm looking to my son, and he's barely touched his lobster. I said, hey, Trev, you going to have your lobster, or don't you like it? He says, well, I'm only so-so for lobster. Hey, Trev, you want the car this weekend? That's called win-win. Well, the next one, of course, is Peking duck, right? It's 3 different dishes. The first one is that crispy skin, the thin layer of bread, hoisin sauce, you wrap it all up. And they took it away. I get 1/10 of it, okay? Next came a soup, which I wasn't really crazy about, but guess what? I got an equal portion. Eventually, I asked if I could tell the waiter, saying, hey, it's okay, we'll divide it up ourselves. Thank you very much. So when the plates came, Hayne could dive into it, well, as the first round, of course, but you wait, make sure everyone's had their portion. Everyone gets to eat whatever they want. I use this as a metaphor for participation, engagement, rights. The dinner is a Chinese Cantonese seafood restaurant. Everyone's invited to participate, but can they? Some people cannot eat seafood. Some people are vegetarian. Some people are vegan. Some people prefer Shanghainese or Mandarin food, which is spicier. Some people actually don't like Chinese food. How do you participate? You sit with me at a dinner, I'll encourage you to use chopsticks. You want to know why? It may slow you down. Okay? The restaurants, most restaurants will say they're wheelchair accessible, maybe to dining, but are the washrooms? So I pose this with the best of intentions that everyone's welcome. Does everyone participate? How do you have a meal which it is inclusive? People participate, they're engaged. How do we have a society in which people are engaged and also participate? I brought along some show and tell. The first one I'd like to show I think, can you still see it? August 1st, 1939. That's my parents' wedding photo. It's in Vancouver, 713 East Georgia. That's Mom. That was my dad. We're so happy. My grandmother, I wrote a short story based on my grandmother's voice, was so happy that my mother had married by choice. My mother was born in Victoria, but she was never a citizen at that time because Chinese were not allowed to be citizens. She married an alien, my father, a Hong Kong businessman. So she basically, there you go, folks. Any chance you have, you're out. So as a result, we were all born in Hong Kong. I'm going to mention too, there's a gentleman over here, that's my Uncle James, my mother's brother. I'll make reference to him. After the war, 1947, Canada sets its first Citizenship Act, and it defines Canadian citizenship for the first time. People who are born in Canada are entitled to citizenship, including my mother, including many other people who were born here, but because of the color of their skin, they were denied. It just didn't come like, oh, we give a Citizenship Act. It was lobbied for. It's a picture of my Uncle James. This is his induction photograph. He looks a little bit scared. Don't blame him. 1943. He and 600 others, Chinese Canadian, fought for Canada, enlisted. And they were adamant that when they came back, they would have the vote. Oh, by the way, Uncle James is 92 years old. He's alive and well, living in Edmonton. We're very proud of him. I was going through my mother's things, and I found her petition for Certificate of Canadian Citizenship. It's 1951. Living in Hong Kong, she could apply for citizenship because she was indeed born in Victoria, BC. So she applied for that, and we came over in 1952. I mentioned in my brief resume, I came to Canada, I spoke three words of English, and it was a challenge learning the alphabet. Here I am, kindergarten, I had mastered the alphabet, Good Shepherd Anglican Church in Strathcona in Chinatown. My father became a citizen in 1961. We became citizens too. So this is our certificate. 1960, 61. Interesting time. Because that was the year that First Nations people finally got to vote federally. What took so long? It was about that same time, 1960, the city of Vancouver proposed what they called slum clearance of Chinatown, Strathcona. Slum. Definition of a slum is rundown housing, crime, breakdown of the community. In Strathcona, it was older housing, but there was very little crime. The community was very strong. The city of Vancouver was adamant on destroying and tearing down urban renewal. How proud were they? This is, you can't quite see this, but this is Mayor Tom Alsbury having a photo op tearing down a Chinese slum. Mayor's hammer shatters slums. Okay, that's 1960s. And there's also a lot of other newspaper headlines from that time. The residents of Strathcona were to fight that urban renewal, but that was not successful in doing that until about 1968, 1970. 72, the rehabilitation agreement was signed. 1967 is also a very interesting date. 1967 is when Canada removes racist language in the Immigration Act. There's no more restrictions based on your racial origin. 1967. Canada signed UN Declaration in 1948 of Human Rights. Almost 20 years. What took so long? Also in 1967, City of Vancouver, I should mention City Hall has changed a lot since then, okay? This is a headline, Chinatown sliced for freeway. 1967, October 23rd. Gosh, it's 43 years. City planners, city politicians, city administrator, we won't mention names, but his initials are Gerald Sutton Brown, said freeways are good for Vancouver, freeways are good for Chinatown. You can rebuild around towards it. There was such an outcry, not only in Chinatown, but throughout the city of Vancouver and here at UBC, that it took about 5 years to finally remove and defend any semblance of freeways for Vancouver. And during that time, there was a major reform movement civically with a new civic political party that came to power during the 1970s and 80s. I use this example of, so you have citizenship. You can vote. Who's got power? Who controls the power? Who controls the rules of the game as to how you participate? There's still some surprising things that sort of happen in Chinatown now and then, and even as recent as last year, there were elements amongst some of the business people, Chinese and non-Chinese, that wanted a 30-story tower in the heart of Chinatown, demolishing the Chinese Culture Center next to the Chinese Garden. You know. It came up for public discussion, and fortunately, it was not approved. But these things come up. So I pose to you, with the theme of what was stated earlier about citizenship, legal status, political activity, identity. Let me add others to that is, what about engagement? What about opportunity to have that level playing field? Who is still in control? What is the access? Thank you very much.